interesting questions later on, you might want to prepare for it. Okay, Paul, ready. Welcome to the Summit Old Guard. Our presentation today will be by Dr. Ashley Koning. Dr. Koning received her bachelor's degree in government and music, and maybe you can tell us what instrument you played and or what music you studied. She got her master's degree from Columbia, and she got her PhD in political science from Rutgers University. I'll try to be very brief here. Obviously, a person that's a director of the Eagleton Center for Public Interest Polling is very qualified. The Rutgers Eagleton poll is the oldest statewide political poll in the country. Her research interests are in the American public opinion. She has contributed to book chapters, public opinion polls. She has numerous awards and recognition. And finally, I saw her on the BBC Evening News. So she's been in the news a couple of times and very much in demand for what is happening in the industry and our society here at the end of the year. So with that, Dr. Koning, please.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I really, really appreciate it. Take it a little bit easy on me. As Alan and Paul know, we have a newborn, so he was up quite a while last night. So maybe he was excited for this presentation too and didn't want to go to sleep. As Alan mentioned, it's been really exciting. Actually, I've done the BBC and Sky News now a couple of times, so it's quite a unique challenge trying to explain polling in our election system internationally to those across the pond. So it's always kind of fun to see the bewilderment of, well, what do you mean you don't base it on the popular vote? So it's been really fun trying to explain it in that context. And as a little side note, actually, the BBC was also doing a podcast earlier in the year before the pandemic. And so I was a guest on one of their political podcasts. And it's just fascinating to kind of see that cross-culture and the cultural divide in terms of understanding electoral systems. So we're here today to talk about one specific area of the electoral system, which is polling. That's what I do. I think it's a really important part of a democratic process. So I'm gonna give a little bit of an overview. I know a lot of you gentlemen are probably familiar with polling. I know there have been polling talks in the past, so I just always think it's a good idea to kind of review the basics and what we should be looking out for in any election cycle, or really with any poll election cycle or not, and then let's get into a little bit of 2020. So let me share my screen. Let's see. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
It looks good.
Okay, are you seeing the full PowerPoint right now, not the note slides?
Yes.
Awesome, okay, let's get going. Nothing like talking about polling first thing in the morning or mid-morning. So as Alan had mentioned, the Eagleton Center for Public Interest Polling is part of the Eagleton Institute of Politics. We were founded back in 1956. And we are actually one of the first two centers that were founded underneath the flag of the Eagleton Institute. And the Eagleton Institute bridges the divide between kind of the theoretical and the practical of politics. And you can see from the top, we have the Rutgers Eagleton poll, we have the Center for Youth Political Participation, we have the Center on the American Governor, and of course, the very first two centers, our own, and the Center for American Women in Politics, which is internationally recognized. So the Eagleton Center for Public Interest Polling began in 1971. So we've been around since 1971. I like to joke that I have not been. Sometimes that joke lands, sometimes it doesn't. But we're now celebrating actually almost our 50th year as of 2021. Of being in existence. We were the first, as Alan had mentioned, statewide university-based survey research center in the country, kind of sandwiched between two different media markets. We came into our own as an entity of Rutgers and the Eagleton Institute to talk about and listen and interpret public opinion and the voices of New Jerseyans being sandwiched all the time between Philadelphia and New York City. So that was the intent of the poll. We've had a lot of huge names in the polling industry that have actually come through our center, including the other pollsters within the state of New Jersey who were students of this center. I myself was a student of the center. And so we have a pretty neat legacy in terms of being, the first and leading the way for many other state polls. If any of you were familiar with the Eagleton Institute, our previous director of the entire institute, Dr. Ruth Mandel, had passed away within the past year, and now our director is John Farmer. So he's been leading the way and doing an amazing job as we, try to navigate this whole new world of the virtual and all this kind of stuff. And we can talk about a little bit about how that affects polling in general as well. So I am a romantic, you can ask my husband, but I'm a romantic, and I get romantic about polling as well. I think for all of its flaws, I like to believe in the George Gallup way, that this is really one of the most effective ways of measuring democracy and measuring voices in a representative fashion, and that it's an important part of the political process, conveying to policymakers what the public feels. So, in a very rose-colored glasses sense, modern public opinion polling as founded by George Gallup in terms of scientific polling really is meant to be integral to democracy. Now, of course, we know there could be a whole lot of issues with that, and we're going to get into some of those, but I like to never lose sight of this rosier view that George Gallup established. I want to tell you a tiny bit about our own poll. Even though we're not in the game of the horse race polling nationally, we poll only New Jersey all the time. The Rutgers Eagleton poll, as I said, has been around since 1971, and we poll New Jersey residents statewide, 18 years or older, on the telephone with live callers, and we poll them about both statewide and national level issues. We'll get into some of these different things in terms of, as I'm sure all of you know, talking about probability sampling and the split between cell phones and landlines, as cell phones have exponentially increased in recent years, and the very, very big importance of weighting, which is actually one of the biggest takeaways from 2016 that we'll talk about when we get to the information on 2020. So obviously we can't poll everybody. I get varying degrees of this question in a lot of different settings when I give this type of talk about, well, I've never been called. Why have I not been called? This truly can't be representative if I haven't been called. And, obviously this is an effect of us calling a sample. And so this is one of the first things I always try to teach my students, and talking about how, the differences between a poll and a census, and how when we take a poll, we're taking a sample of the population. And so, as many of you most likely know, it's absolutely cost prohibitive and time prohibitive to be calling everybody in a population, especially if we're talking about that population as the state of New Jersey, let alone the entire country. So this next slide is getting old with a lot of my students, but I'm sure you'll all know this familiar face. I always like to describe sampling as, having a little bit of super sauce that you make. So when you're cooking, hopefully a lot cleaner than the Swedish Chef from the Muppets, but when you're cooking something, and I love to cook, I'll take a little spoonful of what I'm making, whether it's sauce or soup or whatnot, and that spoonful is telling you about the whole pot. And so, I try to convey that that's how sampling works. We're taking a representative spoonful, or when you go to the doctor, a representative vial of blood. You're taking that to assess something about the population as a whole. And that's one of the biggest things that's difficult for a lot of individuals to get over about this representation of the whole from a representative, much smaller sample. We have two basic types of sampling. We have probability sampling and non-probability sampling. This is key when we're looking at these polls during election cycles in terms of interpreting what is a credible, good poll versus what is not a credible poll. We ourselves will do almost all probability samples, only probability-based samples when we're talking about the New Jersey statewide population. So any poll you see from us in terms of press releases that are out in the public is based on a probability-based sample, where every member of the statewide population virtually has an equal and known chance of being selected for our sample. Of course, as so many of you most likely know, there are a whole lot of issues that are inherent to probability-based samples where it's not necessarily a simple random sample anymore. But by the same token, pollsters will do a lot to make sure that we finesse the probability-based sample and weight it on the back end so that it is representative. A lot of what's creeping into these most recent election cycles in the past decade or so are these non-probability samples, which are obviously much more cost efficient, much cheaper, easier, and quicker to do because they're simply that, they're sampling for convenience. But that has a whole lot of inherent problems to it, especially when we're trying to determine polling forecasts and polling averages for election cycles and determining what's a credible poll and what's not a credible poll. So a lot of these non-probability samples have been creeping up and acting as legitimate when they're really not. And I'm not sure how many of you have been called for a poll at all recently, but it's been, of varying degrees and levels of credibility and, good practice. I've even been called for several polls within my district myself. So it's definitely polling season right now. And so sampling works because of the following. This is probably one of the most important takeaways, especially from 2016 leading into now 2020, talking about the margin of error. And it's something that the media misses so often when describing these election polls. We obviously know that the more people we talk to, the better the estimate of the population and the smaller the margin of error is that we're going to have. But that only holds up until a certain point. So if we look at the bottom graph in terms of sample size and margin of sampling error, it kind of plateaus in a way once we get to a certain point where more sample size is not really going to buy us a ton more with the margin of error. It's not going to lower the margin of error by a significant amount. So that's really why you see a lot of these polls hovering within that 800 to 1,000 person range. It's simply too expensive for pollsters to keep polling several hundred more people when they would get about the same margin of error overall. The issue that comes into play here, though, is that obviously for a lot of these important subgroups that we're looking at, the margin of error becomes incredibly large when we're not looking at the overall sample. This was a big issue back in 2016 when we were talking about the Republican primaries, especially when the debates were being determined by a percentage point or two, let's say when, Chris Christie was at 3% and let's say Ted Cruz was at 4%. And so it became a really big debate in the polling community and really in the political sphere about these debates being determined based on such tiny percentages when the margins of error were huge. And we were dealing with very small sample sizes. So obviously if we have a small sample size over under 1,000, we're dealing with a much larger margin of error. And especially a lot of these polls and even polls nowadays that are talking about registered voters and likely voters, they may have 300, 400 people in that poll or people that responded to that poll. And then that means we have a pretty sizable margin of error. We have, we're still in the double digits when we have 100 to about 200 respondents within a particular group. So it's always important not only to look at the margin of error in terms of the overall sample, but also for a bunch of different subgroups. And so that's why the size of the sample, oh no, where did it go? Hold on guys, sorry. The PowerPoint just crashed. It had enough with me. Let's start it back up again. But that's why the size of the sample is so important. Because a lot of times we're looking at these very small subgroups and we're talking about these demographics in terms of the shifts that they're going through. And really, if we look at the margin of error, that margin of error may mean, well, it's plus 10 that opinion or it's minus 10 that opinion. And if we're looking at a head-to-head, we should always be keeping in mind if we're looking at the horse race or a head-to-head, that really we have to double that margin of error, because frankly, we have to apply that to each side of the candidate. So that's where it gets even trickier when we're talking about margin of error. It's a very difficult concept to grasp. It's a difficult concept to even explain. And it becomes even more difficult when we're talking about an election. And we're not just talking about a data point of support opposed, but we're actually talking about the head-to-head between two individuals. And so, like I said, we even have to double the margin of error when we're talking about that. So obviously margin of error is influenced by a bunch of different things. It's the price we paid for sampling, and it gets influenced by how we're weighting the sample, the size of the sample, as we talked about, how much of the total population that we're sampling, and how much variance there is in the items that are being measured. So if there's any takeaway, it's that this is just absolutely key to interpreting, especially election results, because then otherwise we start getting those headlines of so-and-so is ahead or so-and-so is behind, when the difference is really by a single point, which is most likely for really any poll within the margin of error. So a big thing that's going through our polling industry right now is talking about methodological transparency. And so this became especially big back in 2016, talking about all of the things that we should be looking for within a poll. And so any good poll consumer should really look for a number of the following items. Whenever you're looking at a poll, you should be looking for who sponsored or paid for the poll. In fact, when I've been getting these calls about taking a poll, that's always one of my first questions: who's sponsoring it? If they're reluctant to tell you who's sponsoring it, probably something is really fishy, or probably it's a targeted poll. And we can even talk about that a little later. Campaign polling is much different from regular public opinion polling. So a lot of times campaigns will go out there with a very targeted message testing, and especially a lot of these congressional district polls that the individual campaigns are doing, and they have a very particular way of fielding that survey and the type of questions they ask. So it's always important to know who sponsored it. It's also important to know what the population is that's being analyzed. We'll talk a little bit about this later on, but it's incredibly important to know if we're talking about registered voters or likely voters. Obviously, while they're similar populations and one is derived from the other, you can't be a likely voter without being registered. They're different. Likely voters are different types of people than registered voters, and we'll see a slightly different race based on who we're analyzing, whether registered or likely voters. Likely voters are obviously the ones who are going to get out and vote. When we're talking about registered voters only, registered voters, obviously some of those will not go out and vote. So including them may not be the best reflection of what will happen on election day. Obviously, we want to know how respondents were chosen and how they were interviewed. This gets back to non-probability sampling and a lot of these online samples that have come up in recent years, and how credible they are in depicting generalizations and representing the population at hand that they're trying to study. The gold standard in the industry has always been doing telephone surveys, because they are the easiest, or the best way, really, not that they're necessarily easy, but they're the best way to get to a representative sample of your population because of the feat of random digit dialing. We can do random digit dialing and obviously come up with a random sample. We don't obviously have a random email generator to pull a random sample of email addresses throughout the United States. In fact, not everybody has an email address. Maybe now with the pandemic, because we're all online, but you get the drift in terms of it's important to know how respondents are contacted. Even when we're on the phone, it's important to know if we're talking about live interviewers and callers, or if we're talking about IVR. Or automated voice, the robocalls essentially, or the robotic voices on the other end. There is a stark difference between surveys that are done with automated voices versus live callers. And we can get into a little bit of that later as well. We talked about why it's so important knowing the margin of error. We should always know what the questions are that are being asked. When the interviews were being conducted, of course, this is key in an election cycle. If something big happens, and we'll talk about this with 2020, if the conventions happen, the debates happen, it's really important to know when the interview was conducted. And we'll talk a little bit about weighting. Weighting is so integral to the process, and of course was one of the biggest missteps in 2016 that pollsters are trying to learn from 2020. To back up to question wording, this is absolutely key, because if you don't know what questions are actually being asked on the poll, you don't know anything about the poll itself or what the resulting public opinion is trying to say. My husband, in fact, was called for a poll the other day, and he gets excited too, since I'm a pollster, and so he'll report back to me. And he got a call, and he was like, honey, he goes, all they said to me was they asked, would I vote for the Republican or the Democrat? And they didn't tell me names. They didn't tell me what the office was. They're relying on my partisan cues. And so that's why it's so important to know how the question is being asked. How are we asking about the race in terms of Trump versus Biden? Are we asking about it after a bunch of questions about COVID? Are we asking about the race after a bunch of questions talking about racial issues? That gets at things like framing and priming. Are we asking it in a particular context? Are we saying, one candidate is going to do poorly with the economy, would you vote for him? So all of these things about question design are so important in terms of, are the questions clear enough? Do you have every response option available to provide the respondent with? What are the response options? Are you providing response options, or are you letting the respondent choose to give whatever response they want to? A lot of times those are called open-ended questions. So are we forcing them into a choice and giving them forced choice or closed-ended responses, or are we allowing them to tell us exactly how they feel? And we'll ask questions a lot of times both ways. If we ask about the most important problem in New Jersey, and we do this quite often, there's going to be a difference if we're letting people, while we may have an inkling of what that may be, there'll be a difference between how people respond if they're allowed to tell us exactly what they think the most important problem is, versus if we give them a set of choices and tell them to pick from those choices. So recognizing question design effects is key, especially in election cycles, and looking at the entire questionnaire and where those head-to-heads fall within the questionnaire is vital to understanding the entire poll. And of course, weighting, and we'll talk a little bit about how this is so important, why this was so important, why there was such a big mess up in 2016. Weighting is key to take that representative sample, and make it more representative of the population. We know that certain demographics are more likely to answer the phone, and this especially would be usually older residents, women, white residents, those who are more politically engaged or interested. So in order to combat those effects on the sample that we collect, even though it's done in a random design, in order to combat those effects, we want to weight the data to US Census parameters. And so this was a huge issue in 2016, because normally we're weighting to demographics such as gender, age, race, and ethnicity. And we'll get to the star demographic from 2016 that kind of jumbled it all up. And we can see the effect that this has on, that weighting has when we're looking at different ways of viewing the sample. If we're talking about registered voters versus likely voters, if we're talking about unweighted versus weighted, looking at those middle two columns, we see that if we weight the data, these numbers slightly shift among registered white voters and registered Hispanic voters and registered voters who say their race and ethnicity is something else. They shift a few points. And so this really makes a difference. Even though there are a few point shifts over here, this can make a real difference in the head-to-head, especially when we're talking about small margins in terms of how we're interpreting head-to-head. So weighting the data has a significant impact on how the results look and how we interpret the results. There was a really neat study back in 2016 that the New York Times Upshot did. They actually gave the exact data set to 4 other different pollsters, told them to apply their own weighting scheme and to report back what their resulting head-to-head was and by what margin. And so, as many of you most likely know, this is a pretty big feat for social science in terms of, researchers are not always keen to share their data sets and to do this kind of collaboration. So this was a huge study and a huge step in showing how different weights and sample frames can really produce different results. And so the New York Times Upshot literally provided the same exact data they had collected unweighted to these 4 other pollsters, national pollsters. And you can see that almost every single margin of victory is different in every scenario. the head-to-heads are different in every single scenario, the actual percentages. And in fact, one research firm, survey research firm, had Trump ahead by a single point, whereas everybody else had Clinton ahead. And this just absolutely exemplifies the importance of who you're talking about in your sample and how you're weighting your sample. There's no magic formula that pollsters use for weighting. It's really up to each individual polling entity about how they decide to weight their data, what demographics they decide to use. And so we can see that these magical formulas that are pretty much very subjective, they all produce different results with the same exact data set. So we're not even talking about different polls and different ways of asking the question. We're talking about the same exact data can be construed or produce different results and then construed differently simply because of how it's weighted, simply because of whether people are dealing with registered voters or likely voters. In fact, I think one of these scenarios is a registered voter scenario as opposed to a likely voter scenario. So we can see that, you know, as a group that is, there's so much science within this group, and that's so exciting, but we can also see how subjective polling can be for being such a science and for being based on statistics and probability. There is really a lot of subjectivity and kind of art within trying to go through the process of polling. One of the biggest takeaways, especially from 2016, is learning that we need to look at the bigger story. And so this has been really emphasized now in 2020 about looking at not just a single poll, but looking at multiple polls and the average or the story or the trend that they create. And in fact, this really can tell you whether or not a single poll is an outlier or whether it fits an ongoing trend or the start of a new trend. But looking at one single poll is never really advised because that one single poll is taken out of the context of everything else. We do know from a lot of political science research that in the aggregate, we really do see you know, that polls are pretty reliable and, you know, that public opinion is pretty steady between monumental public opinion shifts. So it's really important to look at the bigger picture here. And that's why we see a lot of polling forecasts, poll aggregators, such as 538 and Real Clear Politics, because polls are simply that, they are snapshots in time. They are never meant to predict what's happening on election day. They're not meant to be a crystal ball. And we'll talk a little bit about that later as well. We have a number of challenges that are facing us, that have been frankly facing us for a number of years. And so they're not, many of them are not necessarily getting better in 2020. So I'll take off those rose-colored glasses a little bit that I talked about in the beginning and talk about a little bit about these challenges that are quite serious within the industry. You know, cell phones. Cell phones are a huge problem. We'll get to in a second. Online surveying, we talked a little bit about. Response rates, we'll talk about. Escalating costs and determining likely voters. Cell phone rates in terms of wireless only households have risen exponentially within the past decade. We have about now, actually now as of 2019, these results are about 2 years old in the graph. As of 2019, 61% of adults are in a wireless only household. As of December 2019, 70% of children are in a wireless only household. These are huge numbers. About 10 or so years ago, pollsters were really not even including or had just started to include cell phones within their sampling methods. And so I would say probably 10, 15 years ago, it was still very acceptable to have landline only polling. And now we know that landlines have become increasingly more you know, increasingly more predictive of affluent households, of white households, of older households. You know, it's a generational divide of, you know, something as simple as my parents having a landline, my husband and I do not. When I ask my students, they don't even really know what a landline is. So it's a huge difference it makes a huge difference in polling and how polling is done. And it's a huge difference from how polling was done even a decade ago. Pollsters at one point were trying to include about 40, maybe 50% cell phones in their polling and doing what's called a dual frame sample. Now those numbers are up to upwards of 70%. Obviously though, all of this means that we're spending more money because cell phones are more expensive. So for example, Pew Research Center is now doing 75% cell phones. in their telephone surveys. And in fact, many researchers are doing simply cell phone only samples because it actually is just as good as a dual frame survey, whereas a landline only sample is not. And more cell phones means a lot more cost, and we can get into that a little bit later as well if we'd like to. Response rates are, on the other hand, are dropping rapidly. Back in the good old days, there were response rates of way before the 90s of 80, 90%. You got 80, 85% as a pollster, and you would be like, oh, I got a pretty decent response rate. And nowadays, we used to be at 9% through the 2016 election. Because of 2016 fatigue, we've actually dropped down as an industry to about a 6% response rate, which is pretty sad. So we've been in the single digits for the better part of a decade now in terms of response rate, and now even lower. The silver lining to all this is that we do not see a significant difference yet, a statistically significant difference between those who are responding and those who are not. So the representation, the generalizability of the random sample of random digit dialing is still there, but this means our cost is increasing exponentially because so many people are not willing to answer the phone or willing to talk to us as pollsters. So that's why we're down to that 6%. The pandemic silver lining in all of this is an increased response rate, with some pollsters actually seeing upwards of double-digit response rates now, since everybody has been home, especially at the height of the pandemic, people just wanting to talk. So a kind of fascinating reversal of response rates due to the influence of the pandemic. We talked a little bit about this earlier in terms of determining likely voters. Likely voters are a subset of registered voters, but we don't really know who likely voters are. We know everybody in the population. Essentially, we virtually know everybody in the general population. We virtually know all registered voters because we have voter databases, but we can't predict likely voters because we've seen from election cycle to election cycle, who decides to turn out becomes wildly different. Basing turnout in 2012 on 2008 would be a huge mistake because we know the historical significance of the 2008 election. 2012, Obama was the incumbent. Basing 2016 on 2012 or 2008, we know they're all different scenarios. So looking at who likely voters are becomes incredibly tricky, and it's another one of those subjective components that a pollster has to determine how they want to predict who a likely voter is, and that significantly affects our results. So as we lead into the 2020 data, I think one of the most important lesson of 2016 is to make sure we embrace the uncertainty of what polling is. So, again, these are snapshots in time, but these are certainly exercises in probability. They are not certain outcomes that we should hang a hat on, especially months out from election day, especially if the poll is not methodologically rigorous or credible. We have to embrace the uncertainty, and that's what a lot of poll aggregators and poll forecasters like 538 have really been trying to stress, that there are a myriad of different outcomes. There is the probability of that some outcomes may happen more than others, but there's always a chance for the other outcome or the outcome with less of a probability to happen, just as we saw in 2016. 538 being the only poll forecaster to give Trump more than a 1% chance back in 2016. They had about a 2/3 to a third split between Clinton and Trump. Now this time around, their election forecast is doing 76-24 in favor of Biden. But again, that still means that there's a 24% chance that the president will have a second term. So that 24% chance is not negligible. As many of you have known, in terms of the scenario or the example of, if you see that in the forecast that there could be a 24% chance of rain, you might bring an umbrella, or you might not plan an outdoor gathering that day. That's a significant portion that should not be dismissed. And so, a lot of the forecasters and aggregators back in 2016 had a 99% to 1% chance. And that is the 1% that happened, or according to 538, the 33% that happened. So, it's important to realize this uncertainty, especially when we're talking about elections. Before we head into 2020, let's rewind a little bit about 2016 and kind of recap what happened in 2016. So we saw that a lot of the issues stemmed from turnout. We didn't see early voting, which had been a buzz in the media. We didn't see that becoming an early predictor of outcome. We saw higher turnout in states that Trump won, and in competitive states which Trump also won. We saw that Clinton was really damaged by lower turnout in a bunch of states that she had won. And so if we look towards the right, we see that Clinton had a much lower turnout than Obama did back in 2012. We see that when we're comparing Romney versus Trump, that Trump had just a slightly lower turnout than Romney when we're comparing 12 to 16. And so the big issues here were Trump won late deciders by 7 points, and a lot of the third-party voters we saw in 2016 shifted to Trump in the end. And of course, we saw a lot more enthusiasm for Trump in 2016 as well. So the big issue, especially, even though we saw that the national polls were right on the money in 2016, the state level polls were not. In fact, we had a historic error that we really had not seen in decades when it came to state level polling. And while it seems small, the 4% error was actually huge in terms of showing a win for Clinton in a lot of these states on average, that states that she actually lost. And so Trump wound up outperforming the polls in a lot of red states, a lot of the key swing states, a lot of states with more whites without college education, which we'll talk more about in a second, and a lot of the Midwestern area and a lot of rural states. So that state level error is huge, and that's attributed to a lot of things. And this is really something that polling has not yet resolved. You know, a lot of these state level polls, while national polls are very well funded, state level polls are not. So they're done few and far between, and not in the most credible fashion, depending upon who is going into that state to poll. So while 2020 pollsters have tried to maybe rectify that a little bit in terms of covering battlegrounds, we still do not have the breadth and the quantity of state polling that we need to be making judgments like we do on the national level. And that's why we saw the national polls in 2016 were pretty much on the money and mimicked the popular vote, but the state polls did not mimic the electoral vote, which is arguably more important to model. The good news is that polls have been fairly accurate for decades. So 2016, while it may have been seen as a blip, a lot of this again points to the state polling issue and talking about state polls and the frequency with which they're done and the credibility within those state polls. But we saw that 2016 polls were actually just as accurate as other presidential elections. If we're talking about national polling, you know, same thing with congressional polls that were done in 2016. And in fact, polls have been slightly even more accurate since 2016. So it's not that there is, you know, there was a lot of investigation following 2016. And so it's not that there's something inherently wrong with polling itself, but more pointing to the issue of how the frequency with which it's done and capturing those late deciders in the final weeks and days of an election. What pollsters have definitely fixed since 2016 is something I've been alluding to all along. If we talk about weighting to education, and this has become regular practice for many pollsters, including ourselves, education became the key demographic that 2016 hung its hat on, as well as Trump's victory to hang its hat on. We see that in 2016, it is the biggest white college, non-college divide of any election in recent history. If we take it one step further, we see that, you know, white voters preferred Trump by, you know, a 4-point margin, college grads. We see a huge split between those with some college or less versus those with a college degree or more. When we're talking about white voters in particular, not as pronounced when we're talking about all voters. So this is a phenomenon that's happening among white voters, something that was not picked up by many pollsters in 2016 because they didn't wait to education. So this has been kind of the silver bullet that a lot of pollsters have been trying to implement in terms of weighting to education now in 2020. In fact, if we look at some of the 2016 data from a University of New Hampshire poll and a Michigan State University poll, we see that that lead without the adjustment for education completely vanishes when we end up adjusting for education. So it's really stark how much education makes a difference when we include it within the weighting adjustments. Let's fast forward now to 2020, or rather fast forward back to present day. We talked a little bit about the mishaps that happened in 2016, the importance of weighting by education. All signs as of right now project Biden to win, whether we're looking at his chances of winning, like we saw in one of the earlier slides, 76% to 24%, whether we're looking at the electoral vote outcome and how that falls based on the state level polling that we have, or whether we're looking at the national polling and how that mimics the popular vote and his steady lead. So one of the most surprising things and why this is different from 2016 this time over is how steady this lead has been since 2019, really. So for almost a year now, how steady Biden's lead over Trump has been. And so we've seen that he's had a pretty healthy lead over Trump, but he's gotten two notable bumps within the past several months, one being the start of the pandemic. If you could see at the very bottom, he started to crater a little bit in terms of the degree to which he was winning over Trump in national polling. But as the pandemic picked up near the end of February, beginning of March, and the first few weeks of March, Biden's margin became much larger over Trump. We see the same thing happening with the protests after the death of George Floyd at the end of May. We see another uptick in the margin Biden has over Trump when we're talking about the start of June onward. So again, we see a pretty sizable lead in terms of election polling for Biden. And this could be a bunch of different things. This could be because of a lot have said he's led an invisible campaign throughout much of the pandemic. So once he cinched the primaries and he was determined as the presumptive nominee, there's been a lot said that he really just kind of stayed in Delaware and did virtual campaign events. And so, the less the spotlight was on him, the more the spotlight was on the president. And it was arguably a very difficult time as the pandemic was coming to a head in March and April. And so that spotlight, for better or worse, was on Trump. So if Trump, did something that was seen negatively by voters, that worked in favor for Biden. Biden leading the invisible campaign, just would kind of shine the spotlight on Trump and not on himself. We had unprecedented events like we talked about in terms of the pandemic and protests. And we actually didn't have very big, if at all, bounces for either convention, the virtual conventions at the end of August. So the lead itself that Biden has is actually the most enduring lead against an incumbent since 1944. And the key here is that he's actually pulling over 50%, and some polling, and at points in different points of the national polling average. He's been at 50 to 51%. And those who have done that, at least 4 months out, they've never gone on to lose an incumbent election. He also is consistently ahead in swing state polls and the states that he would need to get 270 electoral votes. It's also important to look at the size of his lead. So not only has he been leading for essentially almost a year now, but the size of his lead is exceptionally strong and important. So if we look at his average lead, it's a pretty tight lead where it never goes below 4 points or above 10 points. And in fact, 95% of all the national polls are within 6 points of the general polling average. And we haven't seen this since really the Clinton years, or the election cycle in 96 for Clinton. Back in 2016, we saw very tight margins and Clinton sometimes behind in national polling averages, neither of which has happened to Biden. So he has the largest in percentage of margin since Clinton in 1996, and the largest and the longest periods of double-digit leads since Clinton back in 1996. And Biden's lead is actually at this point in the race double what Clinton's was at this point back in 2016. And like I said, there really weren't any significant convention bounces. There's some argument that there was maybe a little bit for Biden, then a little bit for Trump, but these numbers have shockingly remained pretty steady throughout the time so far, with little being able to shake it. There are debates about where this lead is coming from, why it's so steady, why it's enduring, why it's noticeably somewhat large. A lot of this is looking towards the white suburban vote, particularly white suburban women. So white suburban women were a key demographic for Trump back in 2016, especially the white suburban vote as well. In fact, the white suburban vote has gone for the Republican in the past 4 election cycles, except for Obama in 2008. We see that the white suburban vote went slightly for Trump in 2016, as did white suburban women. That's getting flipped on its head. In the 2018 midterms, white suburban women and white women in general propelled kind of that blue wave, or instigators of that blue wave that happened in Congress. And we've also seen Trump slipping in the polls with these particular demographics, which are our key demographics, especially in swing states and especially as swing voters. We also see that Biden has held battleground state leads. While these leads are narrower than his national polling leads, he still is leading in states that Clinton won by less, and in fact, a state that Trump won, talking about Wisconsin. So, especially when we're looking at Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, these are states that Trump is not necessarily focused on, but that are key and that are big battlegrounds that Biden is definitely gaining in. And we can see that the battleground average between several states, he's really held a steady lead again for a long period of time. So, but with all that being said, the race isn't over, and we need to look at some key things to talk about, to know that, anything can still happen on election day. There's been a lot of debate, you may have heard in the news, about something called shy Trumpers. The American Association for Public Opinion Research has said that this is not really a factor. This was not a factor in 2016. Other researchers are arguing that it might be. There was a study recently that came out that claimed to have some evidence of shy Trumpers, although a lot of pollsters have debunked that research. So there's a big debate over shy Trumpers. We always will see a tightening of the race in the final months. So I will guarantee you this margin will get smaller. And Nate Silver from 538 has predicted that if Biden is over 5 percentage points in the national polling in terms of his margin, if Biden is over that, he's pretty much guaranteed to win the Electoral College with increasing probability as his margin widens. If his margin is less than 5 points, it is an increasing probability that Trump will win the Electoral College, and we'll see a very similar popular electoral split as we did in 2016. But it is without a doubt the race is going to tighten as we approach Election Day. We're now in the home stretch. There certainly will be almost undoubtedly an October surprise. This happens all the time. We saw it with Comey back in 2016. We saw that the Comey letters did have some effect on the polling, especially on late deciders. Who knows what can happen in a pandemic during a vaccine race with everything else going on top of it. Voter turnout is absolutely key. We talked about this before, that Clinton really did poorly with the voter turnout she needed in several states with several key demographics. And so voter turnout is key. Whatever the polls say leading up to Election Day doesn't really matter. It matters who actually turns out, who people can mobilize to turn out. And then an enthusiasm gap. There's been a big argument that Trump has voters who are much more passionate, whereas Biden does not. And a lot of Biden voters are voting for the sake of voting against Trump. So there's a lot of debate about, does anger spur people to the polls versus enthusiasm, and how that plays a role on Election Day. As I talked about state polling, we need more state polling. We're still in a deficit as an industry of producing quality state level polls that determine the Electoral College, that mimic the Electoral College. And also there's been some buzz recently that President Trump has garnered higher numbers among Hispanic voters, although this is really concentrated among Hispanics in Florida because of the Cuban vote. But he actually is doing better than he did in 2016 with Hispanic voters. So to wrap up, I would say let's all pay attention to some key things as you're looking at the polls over the next 2 months. It is incredibly important to look for the following. To be a good poll consumer, you always want to look for the usual suspects in terms of methodology: sample size, margin of error, the question wording and who sponsored the poll. A lot of these news organizations, every single news organization essentially has really strong polling units. I would say 538 is a great barometer of scoring those top pollsters in terms of who you can trust and who you shouldn't. So if you're ever questioning a poll, you can head to 538 and they have scores based on how well they predicted previous elections. Media interpretation. The media went wild in 2016 and was interpreting 1 to 2 point leads for Clinton, which again, were never over the 50% mark on average. They were interpreting that as a surefire win. So always look at the poll itself and look under the hood of the poll instead of just relying on media interpretation. We talked about over-reliance on single polls or outlier polls. Always look at the context and the big picture and recognize that close races and tight margins mean more uncertainty, more unpredictability. Also we talked about statewide polling and that the statewide polling unfortunately is rough, and we may not see enough statewide polls that mimic the Electoral College close enough to election day. And we know that the closer we poll to the election day, the more accurate, quote unquote, it may be. But again, this is all an exercise in probability. This is not a crystal ball. And finally, be wary of online polling. There's a lot of panels online out there now. There's a lot of online polls that come out, and the industry is still trying to decipher whether or not this is a wise asset to polling as it becomes more and more prevalent. Because again, the gold standard is unfortunately still telephone, despite how incredibly expensive, as in over $100,000 really nowadays to do a telephone poll, how expensive it is. So as I talked about with Paul, I want to wrap up by showing off a little guy who is now the center of my life and much more important to me than polling right now. So this is my little one. This is William Raymond. And as important as polling is, he is my everything at the end of the day. We are big Star Wars fans, so we dressed him up as Baby Yoda. He's going to be traumatized when he's older. So I thought this would be a nice little lighthearted way to end the meeting. He's growing like a weed. This is football Sunday with Dad and my husband, but he's a cutie pie. We adore him, and hopefully he'll be running data for me in a couple of weeks. I'm going to put him to work. But hopefully that was informative. You are always more than welcome to contact me. Please visit our website, or more than welcome to contact the poll. We also have a Twitter account and a Facebook account. Like I said, we put out press releases about our own data. We don't really focus on the horse race. I mean, New Jersey is New Jersey. We typically know how the election will go in New Jersey. But I also try to look at the national perspective, even though we don't poll nationally. But, please follow us. Please follow our press releases. We've been in the news a bunch and hopefully on the BBC again. So thank you so much. And I'm more than happy to take questions.
Okay, I'm going to remind everyone, if you want to ask a question, use the blue hand in your participant panel, and we'll ask you to unmute when you're ready to ask your question. If you are phoning in, press a *9 on your phone to raise the blue hand, and press a *6 to unmute or mute yourself. Al, you've got the first question. Alejo?
Great talk, Ashley, and your son is so cute.
Thank you. I would have brought him live, but he's napping right now on my mom, on Nana. So he did not get sleep last night, so I don't want to break that bubble.
So my question is, how much impact do you think foreign influence can have on polling?
That's a great question. I mean, so I think there's probably an indirect chain, right? I think if there is foreign influence going on and people are consuming that through their media outlets, and there's a lot of talk about, the networks of me or the networks of we. A lot of the cast sense has had this now for forever, it seems, in terms of people are following the media outlets they want to follow. We don't follow the same news anymore. We don't agree on who credible news sources are anymore. You know, and so it's interesting. I was just listening to something this morning that was talking about the Hispanic vote, especially the Cuban vote going for Trump, and a lot of misinformation, whether foreign entities or not, but putting out a lot of misinformation and incorrect theories out there. And so that may inform somebody's choices and opinion when they actually go to answer a poll, whether it informs how they, how or whether they answer the poll in the first place, or you know, what their views are, or their trust in polling in general. You know, polling has certainly become politicized, and I would say that foreign intervention, or the thoughts of foreign intervention, could very well be having an effect on that. And we also see now, you know, the candidates touting different polls. I mean, and any politician will do this at any election cycle. If the poll is in favor of you, you'll love it. If the poll's not in favor of you, the politician will certainly dismiss it and say, oh, polling stinks, I don't believe in it. So I would say, you know, certainly, and polls, you know, any foreign entity can say to put out a fake poll. So just like, you know, we talk about, you know, whether or not news is fake, you know, there are discussions and conversations about whether or not polls are fake. And it's, to me, it's sad because of those rose-colored glasses, where I think it's such an integral part of democracy, that polling has become politicized since 2016. I think that's why we saw the response rate drop. You know, maybe there's this little bit of the pandemic silver lining, but you know, polls themselves are a lot of people don't trust them, and it's becoming harder and harder to do them.
Am I next?
Yeah, Mark.
Hi, a great presentation and congratulations on the baby. What percentage of the population are truly undecided at this point?
That's a great question. I don't know the exact percentage, but I do know that it's much smaller than 2016. So I think, again, there's been a lot of talk about, are we mimicking 2016? You know, what are the differences and the similarities? That is one of the differences. There's a smaller portion of undecided voters. You know, I think we're in a time of absolute hyperpartisanship and political polarization. We've seen this in Congress for decades now, or for the past decade now. We see this in our election cycles, where both of these candidates have a floor and have a ceiling. So, you know, we see very little movement. Whatever may happen in current events, I mean, we didn't see much movement with the conventions. I would predict not much movement with the debates. I don't think we really have seen much movement with, you know, what has come out over the past several months with President Trump. So it's hard. It's hard to tell whether or not we're going to see any large shifts. And I think a lot of the undecided votes in 2016, we see a smaller percentage this time around, because people are just so crystallized in their opinions going into this election.
Thank you.
George Cole?
Hi, Ashley. It was an interesting talk, and thank you for giving it. And you really have a nice cutie there, having grandchildren myself. The question I have for you is the responses. Actually, a couple of phases on it. Is it usually robocalls? And when you do the call, do you use caller ID to show who is calling? And another part of that question is, during the height of COVID lockdown, a lot of our spam and robocalls that we were getting disappeared due to the fact that most countries that were providing them were also locked down or upset with COVID. So now that the COVID crisis is diminished, we are seeing a lot of these calls coming back. And have you seen fewer and fewer respondents to your calls?
Those are great questions. With the robocall issue, I would say that bad pollsters use robocalling, or IVR, the automated voice recordings. I'll take that back. Not bad pollsters, but they're less credible polls. And there's a big argument in terms of well, if you're not talking to somebody voice to, so that, let me rewind a little bit. When you're talking to somebody voice to voice, when we're talking about live interviewers, there's a whole literature about social desirability bias and interviewer effects. There's research on if you're talking to a woman interviewer, you'll be more likely to support gender issues, women's issues. There was a whole bunch of literature about the Bradley effect, about race, and you would be more reluctant to say that you would vote for the white candidate against the non-white candidate if you perceived you were talking to an interviewer of color. So even the tone of the interviewer, the name the interviewer provides, when we're talking to somebody, you want to kind of put your best foot forward, your best face forward. And so that's social desirability bias, where if you think something you're saying is taboo or wrong, or you are hesitant and you're nervous about it, you may not express your true opinion with live interviewers. By the same token, live interviewers do a lot of good in terms of making the experience more personal and recruitment and keeping people on the phone. So that's why it's still the gold standard within the industry, even though we have some debate over interviewer effects. When we're talking about robocalls, usually it's a cost-saving measure, or not even robocalls, but the IVR, it's a cost-saving measure. It's especially done with smaller campaigns because it's all that can be afforded, and it can only call landlines mainly because you're not allowed to automatically dial cell phones because of the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, which has been frustrating, to be honest, for pollsters. You cannot automatically dial cell phones, which makes it more expensive. You can automatically dial landlines, meaning if I'm an interviewer and I'm hooked up to my system, I can have an auto dial, and I don't have to dial anything. The calls that get picked up are the only calls that come through to me. You cannot do that with cell phones because of all the spamming and telemarketing. You have to dial them manually, which means more person power, which means more money, more cost to polling, because someone is spending extra seconds punching that number into a keypad where you don't have to do that with landlines. So the IVR calling, the automated voices, cannot call cell phones. So you're missing a huge demographic by not calling cell phones. We talked about that before. Cell phones tend to be non-white, younger, in terms of respondents who will answer, usually potentially lower income or middle to lower income. So, a good pollster or a credible poll usually will be live caller. You rarely see one of those credible pollsters doing a type of robopolls. Even are a bad connotation. They're really bad. They're more akin to, they're trying to sway your opinion in a nefarious way or a devious way. The IVR polling, it's still done. There's been some interesting studies about people potentially more likely to admit Trump support in 2016 on an IVR call. But also there are a lot of issues with it. So pollsters tend to stay away from them, at least the polls that get reported. But any poll that is a credible poll should be reporting to you if in fact they used IVR, interactive voice response, automated calling versus live callers. Caller ID, our call center does use caller ID and says that we're from a particular research firm. There's been a discussion within the industry recently about that. Apparently when Gallup had put Gallup on their caller ID, or the Gallup poll, I think they saw about a 5 to 7 percentage point increase in people who were responding. So it's really important to have some sort of caller ID. So like you said, people know it's not spam, but spam, quite frankly, has been damning for the industry because people are more reluctant to answer their phones, less likely to answer their phones now because they think it's telemarketing, they think it's spam. I get numbers all the time that look like a number from my hometown or my current town in New Jersey, but that they're spam. And so it's incredibly frustrating for pollsters. We're trying to make sure the phone numbers that we use to call from are not on the blocked list or on spam lists or likely spam lists, but it's a constant struggle with the survey research industry, the telephone industry, and combating the Telephone Consumer Protection Act.
Thank you.
Griff Smith.
Hi. This is largely covered by what you were just talking about. How can I be poll friendly? I think I've gotten a large enough number of calls that claimed to be pollsters that I'm pretty sure that it's very unlikely that very many of them were legitimate. In my whole life, I think I've only had one or two polls that I could identify and that I knew were actually legitimate.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. I like that, poll friendly. That makes me really happy. I'm going to use that in my future presentations. I would say, always pick up for us if it's Rutgers. If it's the Rutgers Eagleton poll, always talk to us. I would say getting to know, the chances of getting called for a national poll. I don't know the actual statistic, but obviously we're going to be much more likely to get called for these local races and House races in New Jersey, right? Or if there's a Senate race going on, getting called for the Senate race. I know I've gotten a bunch of congressional polling calls. And so they're probably not going to be as great a quality because even though we have some hot races in New Jersey, you're talking about campaigns on limited budgets that are not national campaigns. And so their polling is not going to be as great. I would say not to give homework, but to just kind of have in the back of your head who the credible polls are. It's Pew Research Center, it's Gallup, any of the universities in New Jersey, we're all credible polling units if you get a call from us. If you feel uncomfortable when a pollster calls, I would say ask who's sponsoring the poll. And if they don't really give you a direct answer, or if the questions sound kind of fishy, then I would say end the call with them. So really it's kind of trying to recognize the credible sources out there and separating them from, the mishmash of polling. Unfortunately, we're drowning in polls, especially at election time. And polls serve a really important purpose outside of elections too, because as I like to say, there's a bunch of issues that never get their day at the ballot box. And we need to know public opinion on those too. So then election cycles and the horse race, I feel, hurt us from learning more about public opinion in the future. So I really appreciate you being poll friendly. I love that expression. I think that's fantastic.
We are at 11:30 and the meeting is actually officially, if you want to leave, you can. We can go on for a little while longer. Ashley is willing to stay and we can ask a couple more questions. Paul, do you want to ask your question?
Oh, thanks. Yeah. You don't see a blue hand because hosts don't get to raise blue hands. So you see blue clapping hand for me instead, maybe. So actually, great talk. Thank you so much. Wonderful. And, I'm a statistician myself, and so I can appreciate all of the issues you're talking about. There's one in particular that really troubles me about the telephone non-response. If there's a mechanism which prevents you from reaching some of your random sample, and in this case, people refuse to answer the phone because they've been so traumatized by junk calls. If that mechanism is at all correlated with what it is you want to measure, then you will get very large errors, and they are not random sampling errors. They're actually bias. They're sampling bias errors, and they can swamp the random sampling errors. And so, as I understand it, I've never actually worked in the polling area, but like with the census, I think what they do is they take a certain number of the non-responses, and then they put a lot of effort into reaching those people randomly chosen amongst the, and actually trying to get their data and use them to impute the behavior of the non-respondents. So, I mean, is there any mechanism for studying that potential correlation? In other words, if Republicans are more likely to not pick up the phone than Democrats, right? Republicans are more, I'm making this up, maybe Republicans are more traumatized by junk calls than Democrats, and therefore it's really biasing your sample in a serious way.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, and it's probably the scariest thing I think facing the industry. And the really cop-out answer right now is that Pew Research Center has done a ton of studies, rigorous studies that have shown that there is no differential response bias that is statistically significant between those responding and those not responding, and they've done the recontact and the follow-up of those not responding.
Yeah.
And there have been also some studies in 2016 where, regardless of the candidate, if your candidate was ahead, and this was with a panel, so again, we're talking about a panel, which is different from talking about a random sample. If your candidate was ahead, you were more likely to respond to the panel survey at that time. If your candidate was behind, you were less likely. That happened both for Trump voters and for Clinton voters. I think it's like I feel like the industry's hanging by a thread.
Yeah.
On that issue of that there's no differential response bias right now. Because that can topple everything, especially as polling gets more and more politicized. What happens in 2020, I think, is going to be a big indicator of where the industry goes from there. If we see another quote unquote upset, and by upset I mean in terms of not the election going with what the probability models say, in terms of the higher percentage of winning for Biden. I think and everything costs money, right? So polling is now, to do a single poll, is upwards of $100,000 or more, depending on your specifications. And so that's really expensive. And a lot of the problem with these state pollings, as I was trying to allude to, is we don't have any funding. We don't have any money. We're fighting, all of us, for survival. And especially a lot of the battleground states with small survey research centers. So this is all money. It would be great if we could recontact those who aren't responding, ask them why, or do data imputation, use big data. The census now is trying to, everything with the census is all out of whack because of the pandemic, but the census is trying to do efforts of putting big data and imputing that for those who are not responding, but that all costs money. So when we're talking about state level polling being potentially the most important type of polling in an election cycle, but having the least amount of funding, it completely negates what we need to do. So yeah, it really comes down to, we're okay right now, but we don't have the funding to make sure we're really okay until somebody like Pew does another big study on it.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Walt Meisner?
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Thanks for the very nice talk. I like especially the graph on the margin of error versus sample size. That gave me a very good indication of what to look for in a good polling, scenario. The question I have is, has anybody studied, what the polling results have on voter turnout, especially in swing states? In other words, if there's a large lead, maybe the one that has voters that would vote for the larger lead candidate would say, well, they're going to get in anyway, I don't have to go out. And the ones where their candidate is on the lower end, they say, well, I'm going to go out and make sure they get my vote. Has anybody studied that?
I swear I just saw something about this from 2016 when I was finishing up the presentation. I think that they did show that that can make a difference with media interpretation. If it was a surefire win for Clinton, and so people didn't think they needed to turn out. When you have the underdog, you're more likely to turn out. I think it's just kind of a general rule of political science. That's why a lot of times politicians downplay the polls. If they're ahead, they want to remain ahead, so they don't want to make it look like they're so far ahead they don't need your vote. There's enough that influences whether or not you're going to vote on election day anyway. The weather, what time you're getting out of work, what other commitments you have. You have a screaming baby. So all of these things influence election day to begin with. So if you feel like your candidate is ahead already, that gives you total incentive not to go to the polls. So I think I don't know them off the top of my head, but there's been some discussion about that for 2016. And in general, there's always been that discussion, especially why politicians will kind of, oh, well, we're not ahead by much. You need to still come out and support us. So that definitely plays a role. But to me, I would say that goes back to media interpretation. As so many of you who are of the math and science variety know, you know, we just report the data. We report the results. We do our best as pollsters to report it in an objective fashion, especially if it's a credible pollster. There are some partisan pollsters out there. I would say to do your research and know who they are. But there are, you know, there are a ton of credible pollsters that are objective, nonpartisan, including all of the major news networks and the cable news networks as well, regardless of slant. They all have very credible polling units. But, you know, I think the media interpretation, then the media gets it in its hands, and not that I'm vilifying the media, but their polls are, the probability of an uncertainty is so difficult to interpret. And it's so easy to go to that horse race headline of so-and-so is ahead, so-and-so is behind. Oh, the race changed a point. So-and-so is, you know, getting the lead back. It's so easy to go to that interpretation when it's so much more complicated than that. And that complex storyline is very hard to explain in sound bites and you know, through a newspaper or through the television. And, you know, all that kind of interpretation of who's ahead and who's behind, that's what regular voters are listening to. People who don't really maybe follow the polls, but they hear that, and that may make them, you know, go to election day, make sure that they vote, or stay home.
Ellen?
Dr. Koenig, thank you very much. That was exciting. Now, with the Biden forecast, I think I can take my wife off suicide watch. So she's going to be pleased about those forecasts. But I had a couple of questions. What about the Senate? The Senate apparently hangs on 3 positions. Do you have any information bearing on who may take the Senate?
That is a great question. I don't, just because we you know, we're trying to focus on
Sure.
a lot of national stuff and COVID stuff. But, you know, I think the House has been shown to swing towards Democrats again. You know, the Senate models, I don't know if 538 has released their Senate model yet. Or I know they're not focusing on governorships this year. I do think they're still doing their Senate model. But unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for you on that right now.
No, that's fine. Now, Business Week had a little different slice and dice groups, but they mentioned, for example, just a few of them: Florida's newly enfranchised, shy Trumpers, tired Trumpers, racial justice voters, and finally, the group that we're in, swinging seniors. So those are college-educated seniors in North Carolina and Florida. So can you mention maybe the young voters? Because we're likely to have a record turnout this year.
So again, that's the key, right? Voter turnout. I think, first of all, with all the group names, I think the media, again, not vilifying the media, but I think those who cover election cycles and talk about them want to invent these names. You know, we've talked about soccer moms, Walmart moms, and this is trying to capture that suburban white woman vote especially. And these names are much more generic than what the group actually describes. And when we're looking at polling, polls are pretty blunt instruments. We talked about the relation between sample size and margin of error. You know, if we're polling 800 people total, and then we're trying to get down to these tiny subgroups of, you know, a swinging senior or a Walmart mom or the newly enfranchised or a tired Trumper, we would be lucky if we have 100 people who fit that description in a poll, and most likely we would not. You know, or a poll of 1,000 have 10% of the population be 10% of our sample be that. So most likely we wouldn't. And so I think a lot of these names are characterizing groups that are just way too small to interpret, with double-digit margins of error, and small sample sizes. You know, the youth vote, it's predicted to, you know, turn out to be higher, but again, it all hinges on turnout on election day. You know, that was a pretty rude awakening for Clinton in 2016, where a lot of demographics that were supposedly in support of her were supposed to come out, and they didn't come out on election day, and was really harmful to her in a lot of these battleground states. I saw somebody who said in the chat window, I think, about what is a shy Trumper. I caught that pop up. Essentially, there's a shy Trumper theory since 2016 that people, because of social desirability bias, like I mentioned before, they don't want to confess their support of Trump because they, in 2016, may have been wary and didn't want to admit that they supported Trump because maybe it was a little taboo. You know, we talked about this with gender and race issues, a white versus a non-white candidate. Also, we saw a lot of this with the same-sex marriage issue a decade or so ago. People did not want to admit something that they thought would not be construed as polite or socially desirable or being a good human being or whatever, or controversial, let me say that. So, but that has kind of been debunked. I think shy Trumper may be more of a catchphrase than what's potentially out there. The recent study that is getting this shy Trumper recognition is something about, they asked people, well, if you would go back and vote again, would you vote for Trump? And that's not the same as the vote really being hidden at the time. That's somebody's poor recollection saying, oh yeah, I probably would have. So, you know, that's kind of what the shy Trumper theory is, that people are hesitant to express their support of him. And that's why 2016 evolved the way it did.
Thank you.
Joel, do you want to continue with the questions or do you want to wrap it up?
It's up to you. If you we've certainly have enough people who want to ask questions for a little bit. Why don't we do a couple more questions then?
Okay.
Bill, you want to take your question?
Bill Tittle.
Bill, you got to unmute.
Yes, Ashley, thank you very much. I'm going to make this quick because I want you to get off and get a little shut-eye. You mentioned that the response rate is dramatically dropped at the graph. And I thought I heard you say, but it hasn't really changed results or I guess the accuracy. That really surprises me. Can you elaborate at all on that, or?
It surprises me too. So like Paul had mentioned in his question, and in my response, this points back to looking at those who didn't respond versus those who did respond. You know, that's where we're like, okay, even though we have a single-digit response rate, we can still have confidence that our sample is representative to the general population, because those who are responding are not statistically significantly different from those who are not responding. It's still a very scary thing, in my opinion. It's still very scary that we have a single-digit response rate because of, you know, caller ID, lack of landlines, you know, people not answering their cell phones, people just not wanting to talk on the phone. That's why, you know, this little pandemic silver lining was so interesting, that people wanted to talk to people. They wanted to get back on. In fact, I think we even saw a similar sort of temporary rise around 9/11, if I'm not mistaken, where people wanted to just talk to somebody again. That will probably be fleeting. I don't think this little pandemic bump is going to last too long, especially depending on what happens with the 2020 polling. But it's, you know, it also makes the entire endeavor that much more expensive, because we have to call tens, if not hundreds of people to complete a single interview for a survey. Sometimes we will be calling upwards of 40 to 90 people to get one person who will answer that phone with us. So, you know, it's great that we can still say our samples are representative, and I'm talking about industry-wide, but it's not great that the response rate is so low and the industry has become so costly. And that's why you see people really leaning on online polling, but that's a whole other ball of wax in terms of, you know, cost and accuracy and credibility and representation and representativeness. So yeah, that's unfortunately the best answer we have right now, but I think it's going to be an issue that's enduring until we, you know, have a campaign for everybody to be poll friendly. But you know, it's hard in this kind of climate to get people to be willing to answer polls, and waiting on the back end does help to assuage, you know, the effects of who's answering versus who's not. But you know, it's hard, for lack of a better word. It's hard and it's sad.
Is anyone making a case that being poll friendly is important for our country?
I don't think anybody's making that case enough, frankly. I think, so we have a nationwide organization called APOR, American Association for Public Opinion Research. The organization has begun to kind of get out there in the past several years in terms of either taking stances about the industry, but I really think the APOR had done a big campaign about how to train the media, but I think there's still training needed on the mass poll consumer level, because then they're just going to keep getting misunderstood, and then I'm going to be out of a job because nobody's going to want to do a poll.
All right, I think we could take just one more question, then we have to close off. Steve Varley? You have to unmute, Steve.
Got it. Dr. Koning, first of all, thank you for a great talk. You managed to be both professional and personable. As you know, the first presidential debates are coming up in just 2 weeks' time on September the 29th. Typically, how much of an impact do those presidential debates have? And would you be willing to speculate that given the personalities involved this year, that we might have a disproportionate impact coming out of the debates?
Thanks, Steve. That's a great question. I think they're going to be something. I think they're going to be crazy in this pandemic time. Everything is unprecedented, right? I think, though, in general, like we saw with the conventions, we're seeing less and less of a bounce off of these big events. We saw virtually tiny to no bounces off of the conventions. I would expect the same with the debates, despite the personalities, which I think will be fascinating to watch these two guys go against each other. But, you know, we have, when I talk to organizations like all of you, you're all so well informed and you follow this kind of stuff. The average person does not. So they're going to hear the debates filtered through the nightly news, if they even hear about them at all. So the debates may be watched by ardent supporters or by those who are politically interested and engaged, but it's by no means most of the population, most of the voting population even. And I would say there is such, pointing back to hyperpartisanship and polarization, that we have seen such little movement in the race, in President Trump's approval rating. He really, no matter what has been happening, he's been hovering on average around 42 to 43% approval, with very little impact to that. And that is pretty unprecedented for a president. You know, we've seen presidents go from sky high to low approval because we see movement within the population, but the sides are so solidified on each side of the political aisle that we do not see much movement in these numbers now, including with the head-to-head. So I really don't think the debate is going to change that too much. What you're going to see after the debate is polls will come out, and you know, you'll see polls from the networks, and obviously certain people watch certain networks, so you'll see you know, certain favorability towards a certain candidate if you're watching a certain network, because these are instant polls done online. You're going to see hasty polls done like the night of the debate, and those really aren't an accurate indicator. It's the people who have watched, the people who are already engaged, talking about, oh, the debate really impacted me. This is really a small portion of the population. So I would say, just like we saw with the conventions, especially because these debates are going to be in such an unprecedented format, you know, and because we're dealing with a small portion of late deciders this time around, I don't see much moving those floors or ceilings for either Biden or Trump.
Thank you. And with that, I think we'll call it a day. People who want to stay afterwards, we'll have a math interest group meeting that will start, why don't we say at 12 o'clock? And we'll see the rest of you next week. Thank you.
What about our thank you?
Oh, yes.
Wait a minute, the certificate.
That's what I mean.
Okay. Sorry about that. Okay.
Now, Ashley, while he's bringing that up, can we go on to the Eagleton Institute site and make contributions to your efforts?
Oh my gosh, that is way, way too generous.
No.
That's incredibly generous. Yeah, I believe Eagleton allows you to pick a center that you would want to do so.
Right.
If that doesn't pop up, let me know. I'll send you to our foundation coordinator.
Oh, that's fine. So now with the Summit Old Guard, we give certificates of appreciation to all our speakers. At one time, Summit, New Jersey was the orchid growing capital in the US. We'll have to look and find out if anybody's growing orchids in Summit. What they're probably growing in Summit these days are trust funds. But we also have an Old Guard salute, and I see that, is everyone unmuted, Joel?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, so.
Everybody can unmute.
Okay, so let's give her the salute.